much. It's really wonderful to be here in front of this very selected. I've been told that you guys have been highly selected out of a huge number of applicants. So congratulations, and I'm very pleased that you've invited me to come and speak to you. So I appreciate your attention.
Now this wonderfully soothing recording that we just heard, which just happens to be here in a sealed copy. This is the David Letterman moment. It's actually not that easy to find, so that doesn't really help. But what have we been listening to right there?
The last piece that you heard was called Laser Ballet. This was an album that I did right after I left Stevie Wonder and the Isley brothers and Minnie Riperton and all of the heavy R&B music. And I was what I call boinged out. You know, the bass...
That's not a word they teach you in German English classes.
Okay.
So.
I don't think they teach it in any class. What it really means is that the main use that the synthesizer was put to in most R&B, the primary use was as the bass. We also used it in many other instruments, but we also used it to process the clavinet for Stevie. But in general, the real essence of that makes the difference, I believe, between a lot of the material we put out and the material that came before was the low end. It was the bass, the capability that the synthesizer has of producing incredibly beautiful bass sounds. And as an acoustic bass player, an upright bass player, I really appreciated that. And it was something that was very important in the formulation of the music, because it gave the whole flavor to the music. And so the concept of having the ability to change the bass sound so drastically from something very soft and gentle to something which was really powerful and like, if you like a lead volleyball bouncing down the room, you know, really heavy-duty bass. And most of the stuff with the R&B was of the lead volleyball type. And that was what I meant when I said boinged out. After a while, you hear these sounds, and you get to a point when you're programming the synthesizer, you can't hear anymore. You don't know what you're doing anymore. You lose complete objectivity. And so you have to step back. And at that point, my ex-partner, Bob Margouleff, and I created the phrase boinged out. And one would I would turn to him, or he would turn to me and say, I'm boinged out. And that meant we had to take a break. I was pretty well boinged out with the whole lead volleyball bass thing. Wonderful as it is, anything, if you do it long enough, it gets to be wearing. So I was desperate to try and come up with something softer and gentler and show that the synthesizer could be used for something other than just, you know, powerful bass lines and the occasional lead line. I felt that it was a true instrument, and in fact, that was my attraction to the instrument and why I started building T.O.N.T.O, the original new timbral orchestra, because I felt that an orchestra of synthesizers would be absolutely phenomenal. And I had for many years wanted to experiment with sounds that I couldn't get musicians to play. Time signatures was one of the things I couldn't get many musicians to play, the time signatures I wanted to play. Johnny McLaughlin was the only guy in England that sort of saw things the way I saw them. And we played together. In fact, the last gig I did on bass was at the Edinburgh Festival with Johnny McLaughlin as a trio. And Pete Brown, the lyricist from Cream, he was a poet, actually, and he used to hang out and do jazz and poetry. And so he used to hang out with the weirdos, which was John McLaughlin, myself, and a few other of the younger jazz musicians at the time in London, who were looking for something new and different, and we were trying to break away and not follow the, you know, not be just like following the American lead, although that was important because jazz is, after all, an American art form, and that's what we were playing. But we wanted to have something, bring something different to it. And one of the things we discussed greatly was theory of vibrations and so on. And John and I were very much into vibrations and how they blended together, the harmonics and cycle of fifths and so on and so forth. And we were also realized that if you slowed down vibrations enough, you go below the limit of hearing, and if you make the vibration such that you can hear it, in other words, not a sine wave because that's smooth, there's no edge, but if you make it a pulse or something with a leading edge, you start to get tempo. Slows down below 20 cycles, your ears start to drop away now, your body starts to pick it up, and it becomes tempo. Excuse me. So the concept that we had with time and everything was, well, why wouldn't you be able to play like harmonies in rhythm? And the first obvious harmony was already staring us in the face and was the underlying backpinning of jazz, underpinning of jazz, which is 2 against 3. Well, that's like the second and third harmonic beating together. Now, theory of vibrations will tell you that you get the sum and the difference. That means you'll get 1 and you'll get 4. Well, 1 is the fundamental, 4 is 2 octaves above the 2, which is the octave above the fundamental. And you now have the 3 is the fifth, so you have a complete 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 4 harmonics. Now, if you actually do that rhythmically, you get that very, very well known. You want to hold this for a second? You get that, it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Well, good to go. Well, that's very African. It's very rhythmic. It's the basis of jazz. A lot of jazz is built on that 2 against 3. But that's harmonics, slowed down. So we decided, well, what if you did the 5 too? What if you slowed the 5th harmonic, which is the 3rd? And we found that worked too. And to this day, I still play jazz once a week because on upright bass because I keep my fingers in, I got to keep my ear in, I got to keep playing. And I got to keep in touch with the roots, the basic instrument, 4 strings and a piece of wood. There's nothing more basic than that. Doesn't matter if the power goes out, I can still play. In fact, one of my fantasies was to have a live performance where right in the middle of the performance, everything went out, including the exit lights. And then sort of you just hear the bass come through. Then people realize they've been fooled. But it never came to be. It was just an idea. But the concept here was to create a rhythmic major chord, 1, 3, 5, which is 1, 3, 5, first, third, and 5th harmonic. And that major chord then should sound good rhythmically. And as I say, when I'm playing jazz waltzes, I'll play 5 across it. And the guys I'm playing with now know what I'm doing. At first, they used to think I was trying to play 6 and missing. But when I explained to them, no, you just stay where you are. And I wrote a piece called 3/4, 4/4, 5/4. What 4 and why 4, I don't know. But that was the general idea. And I have the drummer playing in 4/4, the piano player playing in 3/4, and I play in 5/4 because nobody else could do it. So, but that was the problem we had with John McLaughlin. We were playing things in 21/8. Sound complicated? No. Can you count to 3? All right. You do 3 measures of 3/4 and a half a measure of 3/4. Yes, I did say a half a measure, i.e. 3/8. 1.5 beats. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 1 and a 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 1 and a 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1 and a. It's 21/8. Doesn't sound bad, does it? Johnny and I wrote a piece in 21/8 and played it at the Edinburgh Festival, but that was part of the thing. It wasn't until I came to America and some years later that I was introduced to the Moog synthesizer and realized that this was an instrument in which I could do anything I wanted to, any concept that I came up with. So I started experimenting with putting the sequences into 7/4 time and playing against them, and I got it so that I could actually feel 7/4. Until then, I couldn't get anybody to play it long enough or often enough for me to get into it, to get a feel for it. And I think this was also true of people like Dave Brubeck with his Take 5, and later on the Rondo a la Turk. Dave Brubeck was into experimenting with different time signatures. But that was the motivation for me to get into synthesizer, was not just that it could play different time signatures, but that it could come up with sounds that just were never anything you heard before. And the opportunity to actually play with a synthesizer occurred a year after I came to the States. I'd had, well, maybe a little brief inkling that there was such a thing as a Moog synthesizer. I'd seen the credit on the Beatles records, The Wall, and I listened to The Wall, and it didn't sound a lot like anything I really wanted to do, but it did have some interesting things in it, but it was sort of a bit, I don't know, it didn't have any forms in the music. It was interesting stuff, but I got the impression they were just like recording, running the tape and playing with the knobs and seeing what came out. And that's pretty well what I ended up doing when I ran into the first synthesizer, which was in Media Sound. I'd been in the States by then for a year. I don't know how much history you want before that.
There's a lot of that, and but I think before we get into that, there's two things that strike me about this in particular, and that people find probably a little difficult when they listen to non-per se dance music, is A, how to rhythmically organize it, and B, you hinted that this particular piece or this particular album was also used to be the basis for poetry and spoken word as well. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
One of the reasons why this album is not out there, and I didn't push it out there in a way to sort of promote myself, this was after I broke up with Stevie and my partner, Bob Margouleff at the time, and I ended up with the synthesizer, and which I still have. It's alive and well, and living in upstate New York with me, about 10 miles from Woodstock. But this particular set of pieces, as I say, were originally done as a sort of a therapy thing for me to get away from the lead volleyball type bass lines. You'll notice that in this particular record there are no bass lines like that at all. And every time I got into going to do that, there was a doctor who was a friend of mine. We called him Dr. Jim Levin. And he was very into fine art and music and everything. He was very supportive. And he would come down to the studio and just hang out there and would lay down on the couch. And every time I would go to a bass sound and start playing, he would call, "No lead volleyballs." Yeah, I understand, right? In a sense, he was my therapist, I suppose. You know, it was never officially that, but that's sort of the role. Well, during that time, the record company that I was making this record for was called Unity Records, and they got a call from one Muhammad Ali, who called them up because of their name and said, "I have these spoken word pieces that I've been putting together," and they were to do with his training in the Muslim faith. And he just wanted to record them and put them out, and he thought that he would find a record company that was the appropriate name, and he found Unity Records in the record, and he just called them up because of their name. And of course, Peter Georgie, who was the president of Unity Records, called me and said, "I've got this thing with Muhammad Ali. Would you produce it for me? Because obviously, you know how to do this stuff. Hopefully, you'll be able to help me out with this." So I agreed to do that, and we went into the studio and recorded 5 lectures. Each of them, they varied from 12 minutes to about 30 minutes in length. And the purpose of life, the tragedy of life, heart, and God, and prayer. That was what they were about. And I thought they were worthwhile things. And it so happened that he did one version of one of the lectures called God, and I gave him a copy on the cassette of the lecture, which I'd edited all the ums and ahs out because he was just losing his speech at that time. He knew he had Parkinson's. That's why there was a little bit of urgency about it. His speech was just becoming slurred. They wanted to catch it before he couldn't speak anymore. And so we had had these sessions and everything, and I gave him this cassette, and I put this music behind it because it seemed like it fitted to me. And he flipped. He thought it was wonderful. He said, "Oh, this is great. You've got to put it out this way." Well, unfortunately, Unity went bankrupt. And then a series of unfortunate events happened after that, which prevented this record from coming out. And it was going to come out. I'd almost got... I've been trying to work on this for 30 years. But about 15 years ago, I was almost... got it through and crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and then of course 9/11 happened, and the record company got cold feet and said, "No, we can't put anything like this out about Muslim people." And I said, "But it's Muhammad Ali," and they said, "Don't care, doesn't matter who it is, not the climate right now." So it went back into mothballs. I'm still trying to get that released, and I wanted to hold this record, not have it out there on its own, because I didn't want it to appear like we had put the music, he'd just done it over that record. So it never got released. So however, the first pressing, as I said, the record company went bankrupt. I bought out the whole stock of the pressings. So I brought a few with me today. So probably not enough for everybody, but if you do want to get one, and there aren't enough to go around, I will take your name and number and send one to you. But that's the story behind the story.
Wow. That's the bit we should keep off the video and off eBay and all of that. Yeah. Okay. But I'm really curious because obviously Ali at the time, many would argue that he was really instrumental in developing what was later known to be the art form of being an MC, and he has this beautiful cadence in his speech and all, and there's so much rhythm in there. And it's probably an issue a lot of people face in their daily production work. How do you work with or against that rhythm of what you have in a vocal track?
Well, the rhythm of the vocal track, in terms of when it's a spoken word, it's very easy because really there's no real important cadences that are necessary. All you have to do is make it so that it makes sense. And without the music, what we found was it sounded a little disjointed, and you heard all the page turnings, and you heard all the breathing, and it was just a little awkward in the sense that when you just got, like now, there's nothing else going on, but it's something. There's sometimes there are pauses. I'll pause and I try not to do that too much because I feel like a fish out of water. But when there is a gap, it can be filled with something. Usually the gaps in conversation are filled with music. This happens in jazz. These days jazz is only played, as far as I can tell, on the concert hall where everybody comes and just sits quietly and listens and very polite and applauds, or it's in very noisy environments like bars and restaurants. Where it literally is background music. When the conversation stops, the music takes over, and so there's no awkwardness. And when you're dealing with spoken word, it's relatively easy to find those places. And when you've got, you can stop, you can phrase the spoken word in with the music, even though it has its own rhythm. They usually don't conflict. I didn't find it to be conflicting at all with the particular pieces that I did with Muhammad, because you're focusing on him anyway. The music just acts just like it would in a restaurant or a bar as the carrying it through the little silences and awkwardnesses, and covering, more importantly, it was covering over the imperfections in the original recording, which was, you know, very often you can't get him to do it again. He comes in, he sits down, he does it, and he's not the sort of person that you can say, that was very good, but could you say it again with a little more emphasis on the third word? Or he's not going to respond to that. You know, if you were in the ring and you said to him, you know, well, just hunker down a little bit and then hit him with the left, you know, then you could expect him to comply. But I think when it comes to making records or speaking in a certain way, there was no attempt made to regulate him. We just caught him wild, and then I just put it together as best I could. And the thing that got edited was the vocal, the thing that got moved, if anything got moved, because you can't really move the music. So the only thing you can move are the phrases.
Now, seeing that, as you earlier said, it's a room full of very smart people, they by now have figured out that your accent is not exactly American. Nevertheless, the first entry in your discography is a pretty quintessential American recording, and we wondered what your role in that one was. Let me quickly play a bit of it.
Well, this is, of course, the Miles Davis Roundabout Midnight record that was made in 1957. And I spent probably a considerable amount of time each year working for Crescendo Records, GMP Crescendo, that's Gene Norman presents. Gene Norman is the president of the label. It's a family label. His son, Neil Norman, is also is now running the label. Gene is in his late 80s. He's in so-so health, but for his age, he's doing quite well. But he employed me in the capacity of archivist to be in charge of looking through his library of recordings. My job was to come up with tapes that had been stashed in there that had never come to light. And this was easy to do because he was also a promoter, a concert promoter, and he also opened a club called the Crescendo Club, specifically for the Stan Kenton band. Crescendo is the Kenton label. Stan Kenton and Crescendo like synonymous. And he recorded, he was a radio personality in the 40s, and he had a radio program 5 nights a week and a television program 5 nights a week when there were only 4 TV stations in LA. So he was very famous and very rich. And he opened this club called the Crescendo on Sunset Boulevard specifically to present Stan Kenton, because there was nowhere other than concert stages for the band to play when they went to LA. And that was the motivation for him to open the club. So he being a radio guy, whenever he did concerts and promotions, he would record them. Now, in the old days, this is a bit of history, in the 30s, before tape machines, now, tape machines were invented in Germany. They were invented by Telefunken and were only discovered by the Allied forces when, excuse me, I need a little. They were only discovered by the Allied forces when they broke into the bunker that Hitler and Eva Braun were supposedly staying in, and they came across this weird-looking thing, and they didn't know what it was. They eventually discovered it was a tape machine, and the thing about tape machines is that you can't hear the surface noise that you can hear on a disc, and it's very audible. But prior to tape machines, all recordings were done on disc, and that included recordings for broadcasts. And there were 2 ways of recording on a disc. You can record, mono this is, you can record waggling the needle laterally, okay, left to right, and that works quite well. And you can also record waggling the needle vertically. That's called Hill and Dale recording. And that also works quite good, but of course you have problems that show up when you have large amplitudes. When it's left and right, the large amplitudes will tend to cut into the groove you just cut, unless you open up the grooves of revolution before, which requires quite a bit of engineering expertise, and it's not easy to do, unless you have a tape machine, of course. But prior to tape machines, no way. So we had no capability of knowing up front whether there was going to be a loud level that would cut into the previous groove that you just cut. In other words, the needle's going like this. You have to open up one revolution ahead for it not to cause an intercut. As I say, before tape machines, there was no way to do that. There was no way of time delaying. There was no way of seeing what's going to come next. But the radio people could use that method, but they'd have to use a very wide pitch to prevent that from happening on the fly, and so you didn't get very much recording time. It ate space like mad. Whereas with Hill and Dale recording, there wasn't that problem. You could pack the grooves right up against each other, and they would go up and down. Now, the only problem is, of course, if you went too loud, you'd throw the needle up out of the groove and it would jump out, or it would go down into the aluminum, because lacquers, which is what they were in those days, just paint on an aluminum disc. So the radio people, however, decided, at least with this, we can record a fixed amount of time. We can tell how much time we can record, and if we do it at relatively low level, we will be able to record a complete half-an-hour broadcast. And this they were able to do with 33 1/3 microgroove recording, with closely packed grooves that didn't move from side to side, but just moved up and down. So this was the method. But the trouble was, you heard all the clicks and pops. With tape, you didn't hear that. And the upshoot of all of that was, after the Second World War, the tape machines began to be manufactured in the States. Now, the two people who were part of the intelligence team from the US and Allied forces that discovered the machines in the bunker there, and later found out what they did and how they worked, ended up being the founders of Ampex and 3M Corporation. Colonel Ranger was the 3M guy, and I've forgotten the name, A.M. somebody, Pexman or something, I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy who did Ampex, he went with the traditional single friction driven puck, whereas Colonel Ranger came up with what he called isoloop, which was a surrogated puck that had two different diameters and created a loop, an isolated loop to go around the tape heads. Anyhow, this was all part of the situation. So the radio recorders were a company that recorded all types of broadcasts from, they had telephone lines, ordinary, standard telephone lines, and they were 600 ohm termination balanced lines. You've seen 600 ohm balanced lines, that's where they started. And you can feed 600 ohm balanced lines thousands of miles, you can feed it across the country. And they had high-quality telephone lines fixed to every one of these venues. So when Gene Norman, who's an old radio man who knew about recording, he would call up radio recorders and say, "I'm putting on a concert at the Shrine Auditorium tonight. I want you to record it." Now, you can't take a lathe, a cutting lathe, to the Shrine Auditorium. Okay? They're not portable. They've got to be on a 2-ton block of concrete that's floated so that it doesn't get the traffic noise, doesn't get any vibration, so on and so on. You can't move those things. So you bring the sound to it with the telephone lines. And Gene Norman did exactly this with these concerts. So he has all of these tapes. Many of them never been played since the day they came from radio recorders. They were just sent over. And the guy at radio recorders didn't know who was on the tape, what it was, unless he was listening, and most of them weren't. They probably used 2 or 3 lathes because you had to have a backup in case there was a problem technically. And so Gene Norman would ship record his concerts this way, and all you'd find would be a disc, which would be a 15-inch disc. You couldn't play on a normal player anyway. And it would just say, American Festival of Jazz 1957, side 1. No indication who was on it, what it was. So my job was to go through these discs. And later, when they went to tape, they still put the tape machine, the radio recorders, they didn't take the tape machine to the Shrine or the Pasadena Civic or anywhere. They still did it the same way, but they substituted tape machines for the lathes. So Gene Norman religiously recorded all these concerts. I'm going through these tapes, and I'm listening to some of the concert tapes. I didn't do too much with the discs, although I was going through them. It was much more difficult to retrieve from disc. But the tapes were pretty good. So I was going through these tapes, and I came across one, American Festival of Jazz, 1957. I thought, oh, maybe this is Stan Kenton. I put it on, and it's Gene Norman introducing Miles Davis Quintet at the Pasadena Civic, 1957. The only live recording that original quintet made. That's with John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, Red Garland on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, and of course the ubiquitous Paul Chambers on bass. But there are no other live recordings of that group. And so I said to Gene Norman, I found some gold here. I think we're sitting on gold. And I said, we can release this. This is 1957. He says, nope, we can't release it. I said, what do you mean we can't release it? He said, we don't own the rights. I said, how do you mean you don't own the rights? You put on the concert, you paid for the recording, you paid the band. It belongs, surely the tapes belong to you, you can release them. He said, no. He said, you don't understand. Record contracts with artists are exclusive. Doesn't matter who records them, where, all that matters is when. If it is during the period of the contract, guess who owns the rights? The record company who signed the artist. End of story. He said, there's no way we can release this. I said, well, who owns the rights? He says, if you can find that out, maybe we've got a chance. So I went through all the old books. I found out that he was signed to CBS at the time. Fortunately, Gene, who knows everybody in the business, was able to do a deal with CBS, and they literally bought the tapes from Gene Norman for a flat fee, that's under 50 grand, and some small royalty that's still being paid. But the bottom line of it is that they put it out, they re-released the album that group made in 1957 called Round About Midnight, which is what you heard at the beginning here. And they put a second disc out, which was the 30-minute concert that I found and that I restored. And so that's why it's probably because it's most recent, the big ones. It's the top of the list. But Miles is probably one of the biggest artists I've ever had the pleasure to be remotely involved with, but I didn't record it.
Did you personally meet him?
Oh yes, Miles and I, in fact my second child was called Miles, because my wife was pregnant with him at the time when I toured with Miles Davis Quintet. I was in the band that opened for him called the Jazz Five, and we played the first set, and Miles played the second set. That was a 6-week tour of England. It was the first time a full American jazz group had come to England. And I just got out of the Air Force in time to do that gig, which was fantastic. And I got very friendly with Paul Chambers. And Miles turns out to be a really nice guy, actually. All this turning his back and being, obtuse, that's all a big publicity thing, He's actually a really nice guy. And the first day at rehearsal, he had Fran, his wife. I had my wife, Polly, and she's pregnant. Fran's pregnant. Miles comes over to me and says, "That your wife?" Yeah. He grabs her hand. "Come with me." Takes her over. "This is Fran. This is Polly. You guys stick together." So yeah, I never actually played with him. I'd love to have, but I played opposite him, on the, as I say, and had a personal relationship with him, which was excellent.
Let me play something else from probably around the same time.
Yeah, this is very old. This is from my days back in England. I had to even ask who it was. I don't remember this one because this was a piece that I did with Tony Crombie, who was a drummer back in England in the Ronnie Scott days. And it was that I'm playing acoustic bass on this. This is one of my early albums from before my career in America. So.
What was Ronnie Scott's?
Ronnie Scott's is a jazz club that was founded in, I think it was 1959, 1958. It was a the first jazz club in London to be founded by a jazz musician, and it became the mecca for jazz. In fact, the British invasion was part of the reason for its success. That's the British invasion of America. We had all sorts of American appetite for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and a number of the other popular groups from England at the time, the Who, I believe. And we had a problem because of the union situation, the same union situation that prevented me from working later when I came to America, where American musicians couldn't work in England and English musicians couldn't work in America. So what they did, they came up with an interesting formula. Harold Davison was the promoter, and Harold was a very smart man. He owned 51% of Ronnie Scott's. He was the money behind Ronnie Scott's club. And he made all the tour arrangements for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and so on. He was a big promoter. And he did the deal, he got the unions to do a deal which he called man concerts. As far as the union was concerned, it wasn't the money that the men were paid, it was how long they played. In other words, if the Beatles played one concert, that was considered 4-man concerts. And for that, you could get one American musician to come over and do 4 concerts. So they parlayed this into a very clever scheme where for all the Beatle concerts and all the Rolling Stones and all of the pop groups that came over, we built up these man concerts. And then Ronnie would bring over Stan Getz, J.J. Johnson, Johnny Griffin, Roland Kirk, Donald Byrd, Wes Montgomery, as an individual artist, and play with the local rhythm section. And that was where I got to meet lots. I did that for 4 years as the bass player. And the first person I played with was Johnny Griffin, and all the people I just mentioned, I played with all of those. And they would do a 2-week stint. So they did like, 2 weeks would be 14-man concerts, counting the all-nighters because they were counted separately. So 14-man concerts, like 3.5 nights for the Beatles. So we had a constant stream of American top-line jazz musicians coming to Ronnie Scott's to play and playing with the local rhythm section. That's why in 1961, when Miles came over with the full quintet, that was a big deal because that had never been before. But they had some man concerts over, so I got them all over.
You earlier said you just got out of the Air Force in time to play with Miles. What were you doing in the Air Force, and what did you learn there that benefited you in your other ventures?
Good question. When I first went to the Air Force, I wanted to play, of course. I told them I was called up. Conscription, different to the draft. Conscription means everybody goes. Doesn't matter. You have to be pretty well dead before they'll not accept you. Either that or, complete cripple. But the bottom line is that everybody went. Draft, 1 person in 3. That's the difference. But at that time it was conscription in England, and you got deferment if you were studying. So I was studying at the London Polytechnic for a degree in physics at the time, but I was also playing on the TV once a week with Gil Jones, and I was 19 at the time. And that was what got me into the Melody Maker polls, because I was in front of everybody's TV every Monday night. I would be on for 3 minutes, and because I was so young, I used to get featured a lot. And my thermodynamics professor didn't like this much. When we were in class, he said to me, we were discussing entropy. I don't know, you know what that is? Entropy is like sort of the total energy of a system. And he came up with this comment that in a machine, if you run the machine around its complete cycle, there will be some energy lost, and that is known as a loss of entropy. And so the next phrase was the one that got me. He said, and so the entropy of the universe is slowly running down. And this didn't sit with me, because I had read Hoyle, the astronomer Hoyle, and I'd also read Einstein and relativity and a few other advanced tomes on physics, because I was really interested in it. And so I put up my hand and said, well, excuse me, Dr. Fuchs, but surely there's a system, there has to be a balance, but surely in the center of a star, there's fusion going on, and isn't that positive entropy? Well, that was all he needed from me, right? Some people are in this class just to get out of their service to this nation and to the service to Her Majesty, and want to appear on television every week playing jazz. And these sort of people I don't want in my class, so you can leave now and not come back. That was basically his answer. So I got thrown out of the class, which ended up resulting in me not getting, he failed me in thermodynamics, which was an essential for the course. So at the end of my first year, poof, that's it, my deferment's over. I had to go in the forces. So I go in and they say, well, what do you want to do? I say, I want to play. Well, sign here for 9 years. What else can I do? They wouldn't let me do it for national service. No. They said, well, you're very qualified in technical trade. We suggest you go into radio and radar. You'll make the most money there. So to cut a long story short, I ended up doing 9 months of training as a radar fitter, which is down to the last nut, bolt, and screw in a radar in England. And I was in charge of ground control approach, GCA radar, which is talking people down. I didn't do the talking, I did fixing of the equipment, but it's talking people down who are flying. It's being done by pilots, but they talk them down in bad weather, which is all the time in England. And you're parked in 2 trailers on the end of the runway. So you have to be totally self-contained, and you've got to be totally independent of power failures and everything, and you have to keep everything running. So the one trailer is a power truck with 2 diesel generators in it. In case one goes down, you have to bring the other one up, phase it in, flip them over. Oh, complicated stuff. But you had to keep, because it's lives in your hands. You've got people's lives. They're being talked down to land in bad weather. And so I was involved with that, and then they sent me off. After I did my training, I passed out top of my class because I was used to studying. I'd just come out of a year in the Polytechnic, and on the top of my study form, and they posted me to a station just outside Newcastle on Tyne, which was a plotting station with an EMI plotting table, which was, of all things, voltage controlled. One of my jobs was to maintain that table. I did not know that it would later mean that I knew all about voltage control when it came to synthesizers. I knew exactly what was going on. Remember, I'm the guy who has to fix this stuff. I'm not just the guy who's running it. I have to know every nut, bolt, and screw, and when it goes wrong, it's on me. So I had a tremendously good training in electronics, very, very detailed, very, very thorough, for which I'm eternally grateful. It really made a big difference. And the fact that I got sent to this place, this is the only RAF station in the entire world that had an EMI voltage control plotting table, and I get sent there to work on it. It's just it's too serendipitous for words.
Did you know anything about how synthesis could be used for sounds back then?
No, synthesis was not even a thought, or wasn't even in my mind at that time. Synthesizers. This was 1959. I went in 1958. I joined up, and I was in until 61. I was demobbed, and no idea at all that synthesizers were going to come or that voltage control would work. I did, while I was in the Air Force, design a thing which used telephone-type switching rotors and stuff, which I called my music typewriter, which was to type out, you played on it, and it would type it out in music. And it also, I inadvertently, apparently invented the 9-pin dot matrix printer, because that was how I was going to print it out. And I came up with this idea of 9 pins that would go out and print. I didn't know that many, many years later, Seiko were going to do that for the games in Tokyo and come up with a dot matrix printer. Had I known, I would have patented it years before.
Well, maybe that was the Axis getting back for stealing the tape machine. Copyright.
Probably. But that was the whole experience in the Air Force. On one level was very good, and on another level was bad, because it was also in the Air Force while I was up in Newcastle-on-Tyne that I met Michael Jeffries, who was to come back into my life many years later as Jimi Hendrix manager and the owner of Electric Lady Studios, where I worked with Stevie. And he and I started a club called the Downbeat Club. On the same day that Ronnie Scott opened Ronnie Scott's in London, we opened the Downbeat in Newcastle-on-Tyne. And I believe that club is still running. And it turned out that Michael Jeffries was a high-ranking officer in the British Secret Service. I didn't know it at the time. And then he did arrange for me to have a posting down to London, because he knew I wanted to go down and play in the jazz clubs. But it was in exchange for me handing over to him my shares in the club, which I was happy to do, because I knew that there was no way that I could keep track of anything that was 300 miles north. In England, 300 miles is like, you might as well be on the other coast over here. It's like 3,000 miles in America today. Then 300 miles in England was like that. So,
probably something else from England around the time. A little later, though.
What can I say? I worked with a band in England called Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated, which pretty much every British jazz musician of any note went through, and not just jazz musicians, but rock and roll musicians. Alexis was best. He was the person who is probably responsible for the blues still being a viable form of music. It had died in the States. He brought it back to life in England, and it was re-imported with the British invasion. And it was Alexis that was at the bottom of that. And Alexis had everybody and anybody that was any good in his band at some point, including Mick Jagger. I was in the band for a while. The band was constantly moving band. But this was to come back later in 1972 when Stevie I was working with Stevie Wonder at that time. And the big problem was to break Stevie to the wide audience. He was big in R&B, he was big in the black music market, but
big in Italy as well.
Yeah, well, that may be true. I wasn't there, so I'll take your word for it. But
I wasn't even an afterthought.
Anyhow, he came to we came to the realization that in order to break into wide audiences, we had to do something that would get him in front of them. And my lawyer was Johanna Pagoda at the time, who was also Stevie's lawyer, or actually in the process of becoming Stevie's lawyer, which didn't bode well for me in the long run, but at that time we were all one family. It's a very good lawyer. He's a doctor of law from Harvard. You know what they teach in Harvard that's different to every other law school? The art of distraction. Every Harvard lawyer that I've come up against has been an expert in the art of distraction. It took me a while to figure it out, but I did in the end. Anyhow, Johanna and I were talking, and Joe said to me, "Do you know anybody in the Rolling Stones?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you see here in Variety, they're going to do an American tour. And it'd be great if we could get Stevie to open for them." I said, "Well, as it happens, I know Mick." He says, "Great, fine." So we get a call through, and using me as the introduction, Joe gets through, and they connect business-wise. And basically, the conversation went something along the lines of, "Oh, hi, this is Malcolm. I want to introduce you to this Johanna Pagoda. He's my lawyer. Wanted to ask you, do you know Stevie Wonder?" "Oh, yeah, we know Stevie. Yeah. Little Stevie Wonder. Yeah, we like him." I said, "Great." So Joe gets on the phone. "Yeah, but next minute, we know we've got a deal. Stevie's opening for the Stones, 1972 tour. Big, huge tour. We just put out Talking Book. We'd just been roasted by Motown for not having a single on Music of My Mind. The single that we had on there, Mary Wants to Be a Superwoman, Motown didn't consider worth pushing. So, of course, it didn't make a hit. So we didn't have a hit single. But it was our fault, of course. But we decided we were going to definitely have 2 hit singles, one opening each side on Talking Book. And the first one was Superstition, and the second one was Sunshine in My Life. And they were literally, those 2 songs broke Stevie to the wide audience and broke him through in 1972. It was the biggest thing that happened to him.
Nevertheless, I'm a little bit baffled. So the main link up was, what was your involvement in a T-Rex session there? The
T-Rex session was where I was the T-Rex, I did the recordings of all the vocals when they came over there was a huge Mark Boland from T-Rex was a very strange guy. He drove cars with his eyes shut. That's how he died. Driving a car, closing his eyes. He was a really strange guy, but he was an incredible singer. The first person that I had ever worked with in a studio, I did the engineering on Electric Warrior, and he was the first person who I ever was able to record multiple vocals, and it sounded like it was just doubling. He sang exactly the same every time. And we had, I think it was a 12-track machine at the time, 1-inch 12-track that we were working with. And there were, I think, 6 or 7 tracks were filled up with instruments. And he just went on each of them, just one after another. We did the vocals on Electric Warrior in, I think it was 2 afternoons. We did all the vocals on all the songs, multi-tracking them. Just like that. He just went straight through, but never had to retake anything. An amazing vocalist.
What studio was that at?
Media Sound. And Vicente was Tom Vicente was the producer of that one. Yeah.
What happened in between? I mean, how did you get to be the recording engineer on this one and Out of the Army? I feel like there's a little gap there.
A little gap, yeah. When I came out of the Air Force, I went to work at Ronnie's for a number of years. And that was when I played with a lot of the musicians, the American musicians that I mentioned. And then I got to a point where I wanted to progress in, and I wanted to go into a different area of music and experiment and be more, be a more rounded musician and be accepted more, because I was getting this thing about, jazz musicians can't read music, and they can only play jazz, they can't play other things. And this used to infuriate me. So the BBC advertised for a principal bass player for their new radio orchestra, and it's the Queen, charter to the Queen, they've got to advertise in the Melody Maker, they have to take auditions to everybody. So we did the audition for the BBC, and I passed it and became principal bass of the BBC Radio Orchestra. And at the same time, I had my own consultancy business, because when I came out of the Air Force, I needed to make money for my wife and kid, and I had this electronics consultancy business, and I was building equipment for musicians, Georgie Fame and the Blue Fames. I built a PA system. You couldn't buy PA systems in those days. Today, you just walk down to, any of the stores on 47th Street, 48th Street. And
that are not there anymore.
They're not there anymore? It's a while since I've been in the city. But you can buy pretty well, you can go on the net and buy PA systems coming out your ears. But in those days, they had to be custom built. There were no such things. And I was doing guitar amp repairs for Boozy and Hawkes, and they got an inquiry for somebody who wanted a PA system, and that's how it started. And then I went on, put sound system in Ronnie Scott's and in the Establishment Club and Prince Charles Club in England. And I was doing all of that type of thing. And of course, burning the candle at both ends, BBC during the day, Ronnie's at night, and my business in between. Burning the candle at three ends. Of course, guess what? My health gave out. I ended up getting 2 collapsed lungs, and they wouldn't tell my wife that I was going to survive between the operations, the 2 operations. They were operating on the one side, the other side went down. So I'm very lucky to be alive. And after I came out of that operation, they told me I had 3 years to live. And that changed my whole outlook on life, remarkably. And so my wife and I decided that I was going to give up my position at the BBC, and I needed to go to a warmer climate. They told me Arizona or Johannesburg. Both of them 9,000 feet above sea level, with an average of 9 hours of sunshine a day, which is what I needed, apparently, to recover. I felt not strong enough to go to the States, so I went to South Africa. This was during apartheid, and that was not a very good experience. I was there for a year, and the end of it, my wife had to leave for England in a hurry, and I had to get smuggled out by a student of mine, bass playing student, who was South African. He was Afrikaans speaking, which made him special compared to English speaking South Africans, who were considered to be very, very low on the totem pole. So basically, they wanted to throw me in jail for putting on mixed race concerts. And whilst it worked in Cape Town, it didn't work in Joburg. So I left, sneaked out through Mozambique and got a ship to America. We were supposed to go through the Suez Canal, Mediterranean, to New York, but that was a 6-day war, and the Suez Canal was full of sunken ships. So we ended up going across the Pacific, and Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines, and ended up on the west coast of America, in San Francisco. So I entered from the back door, came in through San Francisco. I'm very glad I did, because it gave me a very, very positive view of the States. And I was in California for a year, during which time I tried to play, but I ran into the reverse problem from the other side of the Atlantic with the union and not having a green card and all this stuff, big deal problems. So I ended up having to fall back onto my technical expertise, and I got a job at Pat Boone's studio at SunWest as chief engineer there, and put in the first 16-track studio in LA, and later the end of that year, I moved to New York because I tried 3 times, couldn't get in through the immigration in LA. It was all to do with the Civil Rights Act and the fact that there was no longer a British quota that was never filled and you just walked in if you were British. Now I was standing in line behind everybody, Mexicans, Orientals, everybody who was coming into California, which was a very popular spot. So I was like 9,375,000 in line, you know. So, I ended up going to New York, basically on my way home, and did a 6-week stint at the record plant as chief engineer, during which time I learned a great deal, met a lot of very good people, and met the gentleman who later introduced me to Stevie Wonder, a guy called Ronnie Blanco, who I mistakenly thought worked for the studio, but actually turned out to be the husband of the receptionist, and he was trying to keep an eye on her because she was having an affair with, what's his name, the Wall of Sound, Phil Spector. Phil Spector. Sometimes I remember people by their other names, but he was helping me out, and I didn't realise for 4 days that he didn't work there. It was very funny, but we're still friends, and he's been a big catalyst in my life. He's a bass player too, and he later introduced me to Stevie because he played with Stevie, and he was the one who brought Stevie to me at Media Sound, because after I finished the 6-week stint at Record Plant, which was basically to get the place ready to go public for the first time. They had to have the equipment all in order, and everybody had to be fired because nobody was, all the staff, because they weren't union. This union thing keeps coming up, but different union. This was the electricians union, the mixing engineers union, whatever it was back then. It's now defunct, I believe. I think it's still around in the film business, but not in the record business. And of course, none of the record plant employees were union. And what was happening was TVI was buying out the record plant for like $5 million. And when the engineers heard this was happening, they were breaking the equipment because they knew that if the equipment didn't pass muster, the deal would not go through. And my job was to be a scab and come and fix the equipment in the middle of the night that they were breaking. And I was pretty successful at that. And Chris Stone, at the end of the stint, gave me a piece of paper and said, go and see this man and tell him he needs you. And on the piece of paper was written, Bob Walters, Media Sound, 315 West 57th Street. And I did what he said. I'd never done that before in my life, but I went and gave him this piece of paper and said, got to see Bob Walters. Chris Stone says he needs me. And Bob Walters said, what do you do? I'm a technical engineer, fix stuff. Oh, come on up. And he got his chief engineer to interview me, and halfway through the interview it switched because I had a magnetometer with me. And the first thing he asked me was, of course, how do you align a tape machine? I said, well, first you clean it, and then you check to see if the heads are magnetized. And he looked at me and said, well, how do you do that? I said, I seized the opportunity. I picked up my magnetometer. I said, with a magnetometer, of course. You don't have one? the interview flipped. All of a sudden, I was interviewing him. And it turned out I got the job as chief engineer, and he didn't get fired. We kept him on as the daytime chief engineer. He was a 9-to-5 sort of guy. And he was good. But they needed somebody who was more, shall we say, oriented towards the record industry. So that was where I came in.
Who was recording there at the time?
Richie Havens, that was my first client. Jimmy Ferris. It was also not so much a recording studio for records as it was an ad studio. Madison Avenue booked it out. Hour sessions, hour of strings, hour of horns, hour of harp, this is where the synthesizer was. This is where the first part of T.O.N.T.O came in, because when I first walked in there was this synthesizer, a big Moog 3C, sitting in the ISO booth of Studio A. And I thought, oh, this is great. I get to mess around with this thing. And I spent a lot of time looking at it and had an ignition switch on it to turn the power on and off. And I thought, well, it's very interesting. So I made some inquiries, found out it didn't belong to the studio. It belonged to this guy, Bob Margouleff, who apparently only showed occasionally and very late at night. Well, that was my time. I would come in at 5 and work. I'm working on the console in Studio A, and one night, about 5 nights after I'd started work, this guy walks in with a fur coat on, it's winter, and he's got this hair down to his rear end, really long hair. Now, I had wide hair. He had long hair. And he walks in, and I realized straight away this must be Bob Margouleff. So, you know, I said, you must be Bob Margouleff. He said, yes, that's right. You must be the new maintenance engineer. We'd have heard about each other. He said, yes, my name's Malcolm. He said, tell me, do you know how to run this? And he points to the board, which I've got half open. You know, I said, well, I better. I have to fix it. He says, nobody around here will show me how to run this thing. You know, will you show me how to run it? And I looked at him and said, do you know how to run that thing? And I pointed to the Moog. And he says, I'd better, I own it. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you how to run this, you show me how to run that. He sticks his hand out, he says, deal. And we shook on it, and that's how we started in partnership. And we started that night and started trying to record things, and it was all experimental. It wasn't until 6 months later that Herbie Mann, who I'd played with at Ronnie Scott's, walked in the door, saw me standing there. Oh, what are you doing here? Malcolm, you're Ronnie Scott's, right? I said, yeah, I'm here now. I said, what are you doing? I'm maintenance engineer at the studio. Really? I didn't know you did that. Yeah. Are you doing any music? I'm playing a little bit with Jim Hall. I was playing at the guitar club with Jim Hall, doing subs for Ron Carter, because there was this black-white thing going on in jazz at the time, and Ron Carter was getting a hard time because Jim Hall was white and Ron Carter wasn't, so there was problems going on. So Ron wouldn't show very often at the guitar club, which was like 4 or 5 nights a week. Jim Hall was down there. So guitar club was a block and a half from Media Sound. So Jim Hall would call me up, because I was playing on Sunday afternoons with the New York jazz band, with Al Zoot Sims and Bill Berry, Billy Watrous, and Jim Hall was on guitar, and we had all, you know, really top-line players. It was a great band, and about 50 people in the audience, max. And so he would call me up and say, oh, Ron didn't show again tonight. You'd already done the first set. You want to come down and play the last couple of sets with me? So I'd just grab my bass and run down, because you know, my time was my own. I would go back and work till 4 or 5 in the morning. As long as I got my work done, nobody cared. So that was pretty well what I was doing at the time. And I said to him, well, I'm doing a little bit of that, but talking now to Herbie Mann, I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, I've come down to check on my group that's recording downstairs in Studio B. I said, oh, that's a 16-track studio I just installed. It was the first 16-track studio in New York. And so I said, he said, Neswe and Ahmed Erdogan had advised him not to take out this huge amount of money he'd made from an album called Push Push that had made a huge hit in Japan. They said, no, leave the money in and start a record label. And then if the if any of the albums take off, you're in really good shape. But if they don't, then the money just gets written off. And otherwise, you're just going to pay it in taxes. So that's what he was doing.
That was a different tax scheme at the time, right?
Yes, this was in. This is when it was very common for rich people to invest in records. That's how Unity Records was. That's what Unity Records that put out my Radiance album. They were like, it was a tax thing where Peter George would go and speak to very rich people who needed to write off $10,000 or $10 million in some cases, and I don't think he ever got that high, but 10,000 he would get, you know, oh yes, and then he'd get artists like myself and fund us, and that was how record labels worked. So the idea was, you know, if you lost, if you invested, then it came out of what you would have paid in taxes, and it was a very good system because it kept the industry going really well. It was a lot of well-funded projects at that time. That was at in the heyday of the industry. So I said to Herbie, well, you know, after you've finished listening to your group downstairs, you know, maybe you want to come up and check out this stuff I'm doing on synthesizer. And he goes, synthesizer? Synthesizer? You? Because I was a real purist when he knew me in England. So I said, yeah. He said, well, I said, look, don't knock it till you've heard it. So he did come up, and I played him the first track, which was a track called Aurora, which was the first thing that we had ever tried to put together on synthesizer that first night with Bob and I. And I sort of put dim lighting on in the studio and everything, and invited him in, and I sat him down and played him this, and you got it there? It's like the birth of the universe. We're trying to write timeless music. Music that could have been written at any time in history.
Can you even get as in-depth as to
this is sort of, I hate to break you off here, but do you think you could do 5 words or less, or preferably 1? Anybody? What does a producer want? Oh, yes, produce, yeah, that's not the word. That's cheating. Okay. Okay, this was taught to me by Clive Davis when I failed to get Stevie Wonder to sign off on Superstition when he wrote it for Jeff Beck, and we recorded it and spent $40,000 on the recording of getting him over and putting up the band and hotels and studios and you name it. Anyway, 40 grand later, we have Superstition in the can, and I don't have clearance from Stevie in writing because it's hard to get Stevie to sign anything. I never had. The only contract I have with Stevie is to stop work. I never had a contract of any description with him. So basically I got hauled over the coals by Clive Davis, who was Jeff Beck's label at the time. It was Epic Records, which was under CBS's heading at the time, which was before Arista, when Clive was still at the top of CBS. And he called me to the office and basically said, well, he asked me that question, you know, do you have clearance for Superstition? And I said, well, verbally. He said, no, not verbally. I want to sign it on a piece of paper. And I said, well, no, I don't have that. He said, you call yourself a producer? I said, well, yeah. He said, well, what sort of producer are you? I said, I think I'm a very good one. And I was sort of trying to draw myself up to full height, you know. Sit there, just get the back straight, you know. So he says, I don't think you even know what a producer does. So I said, well, yeah, and I went off into something similar to what we heard from this very nice young lady here. And he did exactly what I did. This is 5 words, or less preferably 1, and I had the same reaction. And he says to me, a producer gets it done. You want 1 word? Delivery. That's your job as a producer, is to deliver. He says, you didn't deliver. I'm not paying these bills. Expensive lesson. But that's what a producer does. So there you go. You got it for free. But that's because you're bright. I wasn't so bright.
There's a nice little video that we could probably use because I feel like there might be 1 or 2 more stories we would like to hear despite time constraints. So if we use this little video for an emergency bathroom break, then it runs for about 4 minutes. So do you want to hear this? See this?
Yeah.
New York.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's 1,000,001 questions from that bit alone, and we also hear that there's this thing called the internet, where there's a longer version of a similar documentary around as well. So you might know people in this building that will be able to pass some of that on, maybe. And the one thing, though, I found really interesting. Oh, there's I don't really know where to start, to be honest. The one thing is, obviously, when you now go to the Motown Museum, they tell you how Barry Gordy in his wisdom has detected that artists needed to go a different way and, needed to go take creative control and so on. Somehow that's one side of the story, right?
Yeah, that would be, that makes sense from Barry. From his point of view, he would, I'm quite sure, say something like that. The reality is that Stevie became 21. And in Illinois, which is where he lived, in Detroit, that's where Motown was started. When you turn 21, you come into your majority, which means that any contracts that you had signed when you were under 21 are now null and void. Well, Stevie had discovered when he was 17 that he didn't own his publishing. Now, for those of you who don't understand how big that is, let me point out to you that for an artist or for a composer, publishing is where the money is. You don't make money on your records or your live performances usually. Big money is in publishing. And so when Stevie realized he didn't own any of his publishing, not any, Jobette, the publishing arm of Motown, owned it, he climbed up, because what he used to do was he would compose a song, and then his musical director, Gene Keys, very nice guy, very beautiful man, very knowledgeable, very musical. He would sit down with Stevie. Stevie would play in the tune. Gene would write it out, and then Gene would take it away, arrange it for orchestra, go into the studio, record with the musicians that Motown provided him with, all without Stevie. And then Stevie would be called in, and a Motown staff producer would tell him where to sing, how to sing, what to sing, and just generally produce him in the Motown manner, and then send him away while they went back in and did the mix. And Stevie basically hated this because it never came out, as he said, this is how we got music in my mind. He said, it never comes out like the music in my mind. The music never comes out like it is in my mind. And he wanted to go with the synthesizer for that reason. So the reality is that Stevie became 21 and no longer was bound by those contracts. So he went to Motown and said, okay, I'm not signing with you again. I'm not going to re-sign. Barry Gordy hit the roof. And Stevie said, I want you to pay me what you owe me. And his lawyer, Charles King, had figured out that they were owed $3.1 million. The most that Charles King could get out of Motown at that time was the .1. Stevie got $100,000 put into his trust fund account, as he called it. And that was what we used to make Music in My Mind and Talking Book. Because he was not under contract to Motown at all during the making of Music in My Mind. And that's one of the reasons I never had a contract with Stevie, because he didn't have a contract with a record company. So there was nobody, as you may know, if you don't know, you should know, and I will tell you now, if you want to have, you have an artist who's got a label deal already, and you're producing him, you have to get a letter of direction from the artist to the record company to get paid. Because they're going to pay you out of his money. They don't pay you separately. Now, that's the way it was back then. I don't know, obviously things change. But that is the basic rule, is that the record company, is they pay the artist, and now if the artist goes and gets his own producer, he has to pay him, and he has to make arrangements. So, being no contract with Motown, or with anybody else for that matter, there was nobody to send a letter of direction to anyway. And plus, you have to remember, I personally had been told I only had 3 years to live. So what is the point in raising a huge hullabaloo about futures that I will probably not even live to see? At least that's how I saw it at the time. It was not on my front burner, shall we say. More important to me was making the music, learning to use the synthesizer and answering all the unanswered questions, musical questions in my head about things like how many intervals are there in an octave, and so on and so forth. I later went on to do I've got a whole proof about how you can make whole tone, how you can make cycles of, resolving cycles of many numbers of different notes. 12 is just one. The cycle of fifths is just one. You can use 17 tones, you can use 19, 22, 24. There are a number of different numbers that will actually come out and give you a resolving cycle of fifths. And as I say, I've got all mathematical proof of all this, plus it all bears out in reality. One of the songs on the T.O.N.T.O album, River Song, the lead line sounds very Middle Eastern. It's in 17-tone scale. Now, how did I get a 17-tone scale on a synthesizer, you ask? You may well ask. Well, I will tell you whether you ask or not. Normally, you tune a synthesizer so it goes C to C as an octave. But what if you were to tune C to F as the octave? That would give you 17 tones. If you want to do 19 tones, you tune C to G as an octave. You can do it on the one upstairs. It sounds very strange, but when you actually start to play it, you will find that there is, with the 17 tone, there is a diatonic and 2 pentatonic scales that you can play. And with 19 tone, there are 2 diatonics and 1 pentatonic scale. And of course, both of them have a chromatic scale. So there's more than 12 tones that can be experimented with. This is something I was trying desperately I was struggling with these whole concepts. And this is what I was trying to figure out and trying to prove in my own way, being partially scientific, partly musical, and a lot feeling and spiritual. Because, you know, the importance of music isn't the technicality of it, it's the emotion of it. It's the message it carries. It's what does it do to you? How does it make you feel? It's all about feeling. And if the music has no feeling, then it doesn't matter how many tone scales it's written in. It doesn't matter how complicated it is. It's meaningless. It has to have some sort of feeling. So all these theoretical ideas that I had were really starting points for me to get me to a new place. Well, Barry Gordy would say, you know, open up my head to some extent. And after playing jazz with some of the greatest musicians, jazz musicians, in the world, and then playing classical and what we could call, say, straight music, because classic was only a 50-year period. Everybody thinks classical music, oh yeah, that's that long hair stuff. There only, you know, it was only a 50-year period really that was classical. Before that was Baroque, and after it came Romantic music. It's not all one thing. So, but the approach really is that it has to convey something. Music is about emotion, and a lot of music is verbal. However, that does strike a problem sometimes because it requires whoever is listening to it to understand the language. And if you happen to not be the native tongue that the song is written in, then it might as well not have any words. And as far as music being a universal language is concerned, I've got big issues with that. It's not a universal language, okay? Clearly not a universal language. A universal language means everybody will understand the same meaning. Okay, what does this mean? What is that? What is that? What is it? Clowns, circus, right? But who knows the title of that piece? What did the composer intend? It's called The March of the Gladiators, people going to their death. Now, I don't know what that's got to do with clowns. Okay? It's usage. It's the fact that it's always been associated and used as clown music in circuses. So we associate it. So that's the association. If you go on the net, you look up Javanese or Balinese gamelan, okay? There's some really good stuff on there. There's some rubbish on there too, but there's some really good stuff. A real Javanese gamelan. But they obviously know what they're doing. There's like 30 of them, and they're working in groups, and they're all going ding 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 ding, and they all know what they're doing. Clearly, they're all doing it together. I don't know what it means. I don't know whether it's a dance for war. I don't know whether it's a marriage. I don't know whether it's celebrating the season. I don't know what the music is about. I have no idea, okay? But clearly, they do. The thing about music that's universal is music itself. Every culture has music. There isn't a culture on earth that does not have music. And this is, I teach music up at Columbia Green Community College. And I always start off, I teach music appreciation and jazz history and history of rock and roll. But the jazz history people, the rock and roll history people, just the history of music period, they're not all musicians. And they're not getting qualifications in the arts. They're not in there to get a fine arts degree. They're in there to get 3 hours of credit in the humanities for their GDE. Okay, that's what they're there for. And guess what we do? I get a deal with them on the first day. I tell them just what I told you. Music is basically, it's a completely universal thing that every culture has. And we're a little tribe. This class is a little tribe. We're a little group of people. There's some music in here. We have our own music. We don't know it yet, but there's music in this room. Okay, well, this room, obviously, but I'm talking about my community college class. And every semester we put on a concert with these kids, many of them never, ever played or been on stage. And some of them, you know, for good reason. But the bottom line is they get an opportunity to stand up and do that. And those of them who can't or who are too embarrassed to do it, just can't get over it, they've got to do something to contribute towards the event. One lady usually cooks food for everybody between the rehearsal and the performance, and for the outside people, somebody does the posters, somebody else does the invitations to the bigwigs, so on and so forth. We spread it around, and they do it. I don't do it. I make them do it, because this is the music of that little tribe. And it's really to make this point that there is music everywhere. Music itself is ubiquitous. It's everywhere on this earth. And it's the underpinning, in my opinion, it's the underpinning of the entire human race. It's the one thing that distinguishes us as a race from the animals. Now, I can't say that with true definition because I don't speak bird, I don't speak whale. You know, I don't speak dog. I speak a little cat, but that's because I live with 3 of them. But it rubs off after a time. You get me out means open the door. You know, me in means open the door the other way. But in general, music, I believe, is what distinguishes us. As we see the definition of music, because when Bob and I first started putting this T.O.N.T.O's expanding headband stuff together, particularly like Jet Sex, which doesn't have any pitched sounds until the very end. It's only got, you know, like 3 notes in the whole piece. And we asked the question, is this music? And I went to the Dictionary of Music, the Penguin Library Dictionary of Music. It's a typical British thing, paperback I have. I look up definition of music. Sounds that are grouped together by people for other people to hear, or words to that effect. In other words, music is sounds that are intended to be played or to put together for other people to hear. They're not just put together in a vacuum. And so that's music. And so as soon as I saw that definition, I turned around to Bob and said, yep, that's music. We put this together for other people to hear. It's music. It doesn't have to have any other attribute. And then it all becomes a matter of taste and conveying. And there are 4 points of view when you're making a record or when you're producing any piece of music that's going to go out there that is seriously intended to be distributed. And the 4 points of view are really like geometrical points. You can draw them, the parallel between geometry. The 4 points of view are first of all, the artistic point of view, which is the creator, whoever created it. Now, without the creator, there's nothing. I'm not talking about the creator, I'm talking about the creator of the piece of music. Without somebody composing or writing the piece of music, there's nothing for any of the other people to do. So that's the primary thing, is the writing. The second function is the producer. Well, the producer gets it done. The producer gets the artist's idea from an idea in the artist's head to something tangible that other people can actually hear. That's the producer's job. And that's a little different point of view to the artist. The artist is trying to get his or her vision out, whereas the producer is trying to extract that vision and perfect it and improve upon it and clarify it. The third person who's absolute, or the third point of view that is absolutely necessary in the creation process where you're actually creating this product, okay, is of course the technical person, the engineer. And they come from a very different point of view. Their job is to make sure that there's no technical imperfections, that there's no things that are going to come up and bite you later and give you big problems down the line. Their job is to make sure that every nuance possible is picked up, and there's absolutely no point in having somebody do a most beautiful, beautiful, delicate passage if the mic is 3 feet away and you can't hear what he's doing. You know, if you've got to crank it up and all you hear is like through the whole thing, that's not going to work. So engineering has to also come from a musical point of view. But those are the only 3 points of view necessary to create the product itself, the actual sounds, okay? And the points have to have lines connecting them, just like in a geometrical figure. And the lines are lines of communication, and they have to be two-way to be strong. In other words, the engineer has to have a strong line of communication with the producer and the artist, okay? Because when the producer says, I want you to go back to the bridge, the engineer has to be able to interpret and say, oh, that's number 1 minute 22. Okay, and knows where to take the machine, whether it be tape or solid state, back to the point that you want to go in. He has to be able to translate musical and technical terms backwards and forwards. Talk to the artist in artistic terms, not technical terms. He doesn't want to say, when you sing at that 320 frequency, it really bothers the equipment. I have to do. He's not going to talk to him like that. He's just going to say, hey, man, you know, when you get up in the second, in your middle register, in the upper part there, can you back off the mic a bit? Okay, that's artist speak, you know, rather than tech speak. But he may turn around to the producer and say, look, shall I put him on track 22 or track 24? Which one you got? I mean, which one are we going over? Right? No, that's a different speak. It's a different line of communication. And these lines of communication have to be two-way. The producer has to talk to the artist. Hey, man, you know, when you get to that line, give me a little more oomph there. You know, it's the key. That's the hook. We need the oomph in there. Give me some oomph, right? Or give me a little more green on the snare drum, guy. That snare drum's not sounding green enough. Right? Whatever is necessary to communicate, whatever language you use. So you have these 3 points of view, and you have, therefore, 6 lines of communication, 3 two-way lines, which forms a very strong triangle. And that triangle creates an area, and that area is the area of operation in the studio. That's the area that you... But that's only 3 parts of the story. How many records have ended up not going anywhere? How many people in this room have worked on a record that didn't go anywhere? Yeah, well, it'll be all the hands when you're another 10 years older, okay? Because it happens. And the bottom line here is that the 4th point of view that's needed cannot be in the same area. It has to be outside that area. So if you have the area of operation, say, on the floor here, you have to have another point of view up here that is responsible for distributing and marketing and putting that thing out. That is your record company, that is your sales arm, if you wish. That's another point of view. And if that is going to be strong, and if you're going to get, that will create now a figure which has a volume. It's a tetrahedron. And obviously the volume of that, the bigger the volume, that's the volume of business. That's how many records you sell. So the further away from the area of operation you can keep Mr. Moneybags, the bigger you're going to be, the bigger hit you're liable to have. And the more you can keep him at the tip of a point, the more penetration you're going to have. Because that's the whole idea. So if you follow that model in your head, you'll have a model of how the product works. That's the model I've always used, and it's worked for me. Now, they can be the same person, okay? You can be the producer, you can be the engineer, you can be the artist. But to be all three at once, not possible, because they're different points of view. So, when you're an artist, focus on creating. If you're in front of that microphone, forget about the tape machine. Forget about the technical things. Forget about telling the engineer what frequency to turn up. Let him do his job. Just focus on getting your job done. Get that emotion out there. If you are the producer, focus on getting it done. Focus on delivery. Your job is to deliver a product that is saleable. That's what your job is. And if you are the engineer, focus on getting everything to perfection that you can. Do your job as best you can. And whoever you are, set up lines of communication with the other two people. Now, if you're functioning in two functions, you can't do it at the same point in time. If you're in the studio and you're singing, and now there isn't a producer, it's just somebody on the other side pressing buttons for you. Maybe your old lady, your old man, whatever. And I'm pressing the buttons, fine. There's no production happening there. So you've got to go through the door into the other side of the glass, whether it be real or figurative. As you go through the door, take your real or figurative hat. Take off your artist hat, put on your producer's hat. Now you walk in. Now listen to it like it's somebody else singing or somebody else performing. And say, yeah, well, what would I tell that person? How would I improve that? How would I produce that? And same thing is true if you are the engineer. Your job is to absolutely make sure that there are no technical problems, no technical hitches, and that you do not destroy a work of artistic brilliance because of a technical flaw. Very common mistake. Oh, we've got to do that again. Why? Oh, well, there was a pop on the third. Well, deal with it. Deal with it. The rest of the take was like, huh? We're not going to get that again. I know that down here. Okay? Listen with your soul. Listen with your heart. Don't listen just with your ears. Listen with and not with your. Don't let everything come from cerebral land either. It's got to move you. If it doesn't make the hackles on the back of your neck stand up, if it doesn't make the hairs on your back stand up, it ain't a hit. Okay? When you hear a hit, you'll know it because the hairs on the back of your back, that's what happens with me. I go, this is a hit. I just know, it ain't a hit yet, but this is going to be a smash. And that's probably what the last 5-10 minutes of what I've told you is probably more useful than anything else I've told you today. So, how are we doing?
Well, we could go on for a minute. Speaking of hands-on things, the one thing that strikes one once they see pictures of the T.O.N.T.O, probably that's a good... and that's one example of it, or let me pull up another one. That's
there you go.
is ergonomics, and you saw it a little bit when we saw Stevie perform earlier in the mic positioning as well. Like you seem to care a great deal about the ergonomics of what people are doing there. Can you explain that a little bit, using this as an example here?
Yeah, the way T.O.N.T.O got to be the shape it is, that's not a fisheye lens photograph. That's exactly how T.O.N.T.O is. It actually curves around. Those cabinets appear to be curved. They're in fact 17-inch racks. That's 19-inch rack equipment with the ears taken off. Makes it 17 wide to keep it a bit more elegant. And we had T.O.N.T.O was originally came in cases much like the Moog 2C that's upstairs, that you've, I'm sure, seen in, what was it, Studio One upstairs? Wolf's new acquisition. And the
Cabinets?
I was just trying to think about the best way to put this. The time when we first got T.O.N.T.O, it was in a cabinet much like that one. And then as time went by, we acquired a second Moog 3C, which came out of a place called Electric Circus, which was a nightclub that had a fire. And the cases had been somewhat scorched on the outside. The modules were fine, everything worked, but the cases had been singed. So we picked it up for real cheap.
I mean, real cheap at the time is what exactly? Because that's...
about, real cheap at the time was about 4,000 or 5,000.
Oh, well, that was real cheap.
Yes, they were about 15,000 a year.
I mean, still was the price of a car.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but I mean cheap for what it was. And what we did was we put the two side by side, and in order to try and play it, we had the keyboard on a T-trolley, on wheels. We pull the keyboard from one end of the instrument to the other. This got to be very, very tired very, very quickly. This was not the way to work. So got together with John Storick when we went to Electric Ladyland. He was the architect who designed Electric Lady Studios. And when we got together with John, he was a Buckminster Fuller student. Now, I've never studied with Buckminster Fuller, but I'm very into geodesic domes and triangulation and his whole philosophy. And so when I found out that John Storick had actually studied with the man, I was like, boom, sort of glommed right onto him. And basically we discussed how we could rehouse the T.O.N.T.O modules into a case that was more suitable and more playable, more ergonomic. We wanted it playable from the front, serviceable from the rear. Now, if you go upstairs and you look at that Moog 3C, I haven't looked behind it, but I know what's there. Unless it's a very new model after T.O.N.T.O, they did not have what we call service loops on the back of the modules. And some of the modules, the oscillators, particularly the oscillator controllers, have to be adjusted by pulling out the module and adjusting actual trimmers on the board. The boards are, you have to pull it out of they're still connected. Well, in the original case, you can't do that because there isn't a service loop. The wire's immediately attached with a tie wrap to the whole loom of the other wires. So you have to put in an extender card. Now, here comes a little bit of technical. 1 volt per octave is the standard for voltage-controlled musical instruments. That means 1/12 of a volt is a semitone. 1/12 of a volt, if you divide it into 1,000 millivolts, turns out to be 83.33333 recurring millivolts per semitone. Why is this relevant? Well, that means that if you're going to tune to the nearest cent, you're going to be down to millivolts. 1 millivolt or 1 or 2 millivolts is enough to put you out of tune by 1 or 2 cents. Now, electronic resistance being such as it is, you plug the card in, you plug the extension card in, now you've got a different resistance path going directly into the oscillator you're trying to calibrate. You tune it all up, you take the extender card out, you plug it in, it's out of tune again. Why? Because that card introduced a change of, even though it's a few milliohms, it has put a small difference in there. And people like Stevie can hear that, which brings me to this. This is the little magic box that I used to make sure that our synthesizer was always in tune. This is a joystick controller that I built myself from a remote control for a model aircraft. You could probably control a drone from it these days. But what it is it's a joystick. Now, it's not the first time a joystick has been used with synthesizers. Putney used a joystick on theirs, but their joystick was very hokey and didn't have any springing on it. You couldn't do anything calibrated on it. So what I did was I got this model aircraft controller and I set it up with my brilliant technical ability. If you look in there, you'll see I'm joking. It's a very, very simple circuit which simply provides voltages, two separate voltages out. The horizontal one is I use to control pitch. And notice that it springs to the center. Okay? And the vertical one I use to control the filter. Now, the two things wrong with the Moog 3 and the Moog 2C upstairs, three things. One, it's monophonic. Two, it is not touch sensitive. There is no way to get any dynamics out of that. That's why Walter Carlos had such a huge success with Switched on Bach and not so much with Clockwork Orange. Because Bach was written for instruments that are not touch sensitive. It was written for the harpsichord and the organ. So Bach's music Baroque music sounds great on a synthesizer. But you try to play Beethoven, which is from the Romantic period, came a little later, and you try to play that type of music, now you've got to have dynamics. The synthesizer, the Moog, doesn't do that readily. So how did I get around that? And also, the fact that it only plays one note and not a chord is only half the story with the keyboard. The other half of the story is it's only in tune over 2 octaves. Very hard to get that. You try getting that full keyboard upstairs into tune all the way up, and then you try changing the range. It's difficult. It's tricky, tricky, tricky. You're constantly adjusting. So I came up with a simple solution. And the advantage of this is that there are 2 little white things at the side here that you can see. If you look in the back here, you'll see what they actually do is they change the positions of the physical positions of the pots that this is controlling. And therefore, they're sort of like zeros. They're alignment things to align the center. This is when you're flying a model and you want to get it so that it's flying straight. You adjust these little things. Well, I used the horizontal I used for pitch, and the vertical I used on the filter. Because the filter, if you shut the filter down on an analog synthesizer, it will mute the sound. It'll take the high frequencies out and it'll make the sound more muted, which is sort of touch control, which is sort of sensitivity. And it certainly substitutes well for it. And so between correcting the pitch with my little finger, which as a bass player, I'm very used to doing, okay? Between doing that and changing the filtration with this little knob, not the vertical. And now notice the vertical stays where it is. So once I get a filter sound that I like or that I want to keep, I can just leave it there. And I can also do pitch bends. And these knobs here set the distance of the pitch bends and the amount of up and down that the filter gets. So there's 3 little knobs on there. Very, very simple. And the switches change the polarity, so it goes up or down. Very simple. But this is what enabled me to keep T.O.N.T.O in tune, even if someone else was playing the keyboard. I'd be playing this little guy, okay? And I could sit there with it on my lap. I could sit there at the console with this and still control it and keep Stevie in tune and keep... I'm a musician, first and foremost. This is all about music. And the idea was to help and aid Stevie in getting, or whoever was playing, if it wasn't me, in getting the synthesizer, I would work with them. I'm used to working with a piano player, a saxophone player. I'm used to playing jazz, where I'll turn on a dime. They'll change to a different key, I'm there. They'll change to a different tempo, I'm there. They change to a different mood, I'm there. I'm used to that. So it's no hard deal for me to play this little box. So that's the secret of how T.O.N.T.O was probably the only synthesizer in the early 70s that seemed to be in tune.
We're not only talking about something that's 40 years ago. I mean, when we're thinking about welcoming the Moog upstairs to the family, we talk to the kind person who fixes stuff for a certain German band that's been pretty popular with electronics in the 70s. And he is like, it sounds beautiful, but it's nearly impossible to tune. And so really think hard about it, whether you want that or whether you can live with that. And then you start to wonder, especially at that time, how, I mean, the industry as such did not really exist at that time. Probably as an illustration, this is the total sales. This is not thousands or millions or whatever. That's the total sales of Moog units sold in the years between 1967 and 71 per quarter. So that's in quarter one, 4 units sold. That's not exactly much. And so we're talking about a really small number of people that are actually working in this environment. And so now here you are talking about the different hats that you're wearing, tinkering with your own piece of technology. And at the same time, you got all the Buchlers, Moogs, Dave Smiths, and so on. And how the Oberheims and stuff, how did they react to you? Because there's not only Moog stuff in the T.O.N.T.O, there's all different kinds of things that talk to each other.
I tried to talk to the manufacturers in the early days. Bob Moog used to come down, sit cross-legged on the floor, and would, when I was trying to do the 17-tone thing, he had a unit that would plug into the back of the keyboard. You'll see there's 2 big blue ribbon connectors on the back there. I think there's 2 30-pin connectors each, or bigger. And they are supposed to go to a box that he designed where you can make your own tuning. And we were going to buy this box, and so he brought it down to demonstrate it. Well, he came down 3 or 4 times, sat there, cross-legged on the floor, soldering irons, resistors, this whole thing. I'm standing there trying to do what I can to help, and it's not happening, and it never did. We never did get that thing working. That's why I ended up tuning the thing from C to F to get my 17 tones. Just couldn't get it the other way. So the problem with the Moog and the ARP, for example, the next thing to come up to our attention was the ARP. Well, they both use, as does Oberheim, 1 volt per octave for the pitch. But there's another thing that you need on an analog synthesizer, which is called the trigger, or some parlance is gate. They don't mean the same thing. ARP made the distinction. A trigger is a single pulse that goes up, comes back down. A gate is where it turns on and stays on until you lift the key. That's the difference between a trigger and a gate. ARP noticed that difference. That's the other peculiar thing with the Moog keyboard. If you press down on a key, and now if you don't release that key and press another key, it will only play one of the 2 notes. And the note that it plays is usually the highest of the 2. So you've got, it depends. He changed the circuitry. On some of them it's the lowest. But it only plays one of the 2 notes. It selects the higher or the lower note. And furthermore, it does it with the Moog in order to get the envelope generator to work. Now the envelope, as its name implies, is the package in which the sound is delivered. In other words, it's the on-off pattern. And the envelope is the attack, the initial decay, sustain, and the final decay or release. That's the standard 4-parameter, what we call envelope. And inside that, we turn a voltage-controlled amplifier. It's like a fader. You turn it up, down. It's like an automatic fader. And that controls the gain of the output of the instrument. So you've got with synthesis, it's there's 3 stages. The first stage is you take a rich waveform. That means you take a waveform that's got a lot of harmonics in it. So you have, the more oscillators, the better. One of the secrets of the bass sound on T.O.N.T.O is minimum 3 oscillators. Minimum. Sometimes there are as many as 12, depending upon what we're doing. And they're not all tuned to the same note. And there's also other tricks that we used to get what we call a rich waveform. You need lots and lots of harmonics, because the only way you're going to get your sound is by filtering it, which means subtracting. It's called subtractive synthesis. So you take a rich waveform, you filter it, and then you pinch it on and off with the voltage-controlled amplifier. Now, those 3 processes, if you go from one note to another, and you have in order to turn the note on, you have to have that envelope start. So you have to tell the envelope generator, start now. So we have to send, in addition to the pitch that we send to the oscillator, we have to send a trigger or a gate we have to some signal through to the envelope generator to say, turn on the VCA now. And the envelope generator, you set the parameters on it, and it goes up and repeats those parameters on the VCA. Now, if you change the note after you have started your envelope generator, envelope started, it's going along, and now you change the note. If you change the note without lifting on a Moog, what happens is you don't get the envelope restarting again. The note just changes. So it can go, ba, you keep on playing, and eventually it gets down to the decay and you've got nothing. Whereas if you play individual notes and give the allow that, because you've got a gate, right? So if your gate's continuous, you're not going to get it re-triggered. But if you let the gate, you lift the note, then you push down again, it'll start again. So now you go bong, 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 as the thing from bong. Okay, either re-triggering or not. And that is the big difference in the way you play it. So there's a new thing when you're playing a synthesizer keyboard, a Moog keyboard. Not only is it one note, not only is it not touch sensitive, not only is it out of tune for more than 2 octaves, but in addition to that, if you don't play it right, it won't sound right. It'll sound awful, because you've got to know when to lift, when not to lift, when you want to re-trigger and when you don't. So you've got to think a whole different way about it. So ARP decided they were going to come out with a better idea, which is that every time a new note was struck, even if the gate didn't start, a trigger would go and re-trigger the envelope generator. So they had a different type of envelope generator. The only difference was now it required plus 10 volts, whereas in order to trigger a Moog, it required ground, 0 volts. Moogs trigger when you put ground on them. Very dangerous. Because if you have something plugged into an envelope generator and it accidentally touches ground, it'll trigger it. Out will come your sound. Certainly very dangerous for live performance, but wasn't a good idea. So they went to positive triggering. So ARP went to plus 10 volts, and they had this, in addition, that was the gate. Then they had a trigger for every time you redid it, so you didn't have to worry about whether or not you were lifting. The only trouble was it made everything sound samey again, because every note was da 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 da, same note again, same envelope. So it was a sort of fix, but it wasn't the perfect fix. But my job now is, how do I get an ARP keyboard to play a Moog module, or a Moog keyboard to play an ARP module? Well, the voltage thing was not a problem. They were transposable. You could just put the voltage in for the pitch. That worked. But we had to do a lot of things, and so we finally decided that we would settle on a plus 10 triggering, which was a good thing, because when Oberheim came out with the SEMs, these synthesizer expander modules, they trigger on 5 volts, plus 5. So everybody's got a different thing. EMS triggers on 5 volts as well. So you've got all these different standards, and we had to standardize within T.O.N.T.O. We had to come up with a standard that we would make all instruments so that they could all play nicely with each other. And we're the only instrument that did that.
Do you have a estimate on how much cable you used for that?
That's a new question. There's miles of cable in T.O.N.T.O. The power cable alone is 127 feet long. It's 10-9. That means it's 10 strands of number 9 wire. Number 9 wire is pretty fat. It's not easy to solder. and it's an amazing thing. And that particular piece of cable is a control cable that came from, it was left over from some Apollo mission. I hope it wasn't 13, but it was from one of those missions. And it was 127 feet when we got it, and I refused to cut it. What we did was we put both ends to the same terminal. This may sound like it was short, but if you take a red wire, right, you take it all the way around the instrument, 127 feet, and then join it back to the red terminal, electrically you've only got half of the distance, because you've got two routes for the electricity to get to the source. So it reduces the resistance. So it's like using number 18 wire, or not an 18, excuse me, number 4.5 wire. It'd be twice the size of wire, twice the fatness, because we've got two routes. So we've got, in other words, two pieces of parallel wire, although it's only one wire. And how we achieved that, we didn't want to cut the wire. We just stripped back the insulation, wrapped another piece of 18 gauge wire around it, and then took that to each instrument. So there are 7 spurs off of that. So it's a very complex wiring system. Then there's another 127 feet of control cable, which are, the control cables are 60 internal conductors, of which 20, so it's actually 40, because sorry, it's 20. There's 20 grounds, 20 pluses and 20 minuses, because it's all balanced wiring. We have controls, we have audio, we have what we call trunk mults, which is a way of connecting different parts of the instrument together without having to have a patch cord go from side A to side B. It goes around the wiring into a patch bay. And the patch bay on T.O.N.T.O is horizontal. Most patch bays are vertical. T.O.N.T.O has horizontal patch bay. So there are a lot of different things about it, but the amount of wire, literally, there's got to be a good few miles of wire in there.
I mean, I'm almost dizzy just listening at the numbers of it, or in there. But the one thing that always struck me as well, I mean, as a reference, like, how much did you pay for a car back then?
Well, I think what wasn't a Mustang 2400?
So a Mustang.
I think a Mustang was 2400 back in those days.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's ads when you see Stevie on there for a Mootron, and it's like, oh, the same sound just for under 100K, and you're like, it's like what, like 40-something cars, like, and that's just one instrument. And at the same time, you're telling us that even Stevie, who was one of the most prolific artists of the time, only had 100 grand in his trust fund. Like, something doesn't add up. Like, how did you cope? Like,
well, the way we coped was we didn't make any money. Everything we made, as my good lady will bear me out, everything we made went into the instrument. Everything. we literally, you know, we lived, breathed, and slept. The T.O.N.T.O, you know, that was our livelihood. There was a group of us. There was Bob and I, who were the out front guys. I was the designer, really. Bob wasn't technical. Bob was really good when it came to the business side of things. You need somebody to do that, for sure. And he was very good with sonorities. We used to call it sonorities. That is, hearing tonal qualities, and he was very good at getting down into those things. And really, he had infinite patience. And that was the other thing. He had infinite patience with me, which my lady will also attest you need. But the whole group of us were supported by a background group of people. Polly, my wife, was the librarian. She kept track of every tape that went in and out. So, because we were a production company, we weren't just a synthesizer and engineering firm. We didn't just do engineering. We booked the musicians, we booked the studios, we dealt with the record companies. We did everything that a producer would do, because Stevie couldn't do it. He was just on his own. Stevie was the artist. We treated him as the artist, let him have total artistic reign. Whatever he wanted, he got. Whenever he wanted, as you heard Margouleff say. when we would work any time he wanted to work. And because Stevie is unsighted, he'd call up at 2 a.m. and say, "Hey, we're going in the studio." Okay, we'd be there. Holidays, Christmas, birthday, it didn't matter to him. It was Stevie time. And we worked like that for like 4 straight years. And in order to do that, you have to have a backup team. And Stevie didn't have one, so we were his backup team. Polly did all the library work. We had Dennis Pelletier, who was the fellow who did all the office work. He was the one who took the work orders. What am I talking about? Where are they? I've got some work orders here. He took the work orders. Here's an example of a work order. I'll give you the first one so I don't get out of it. Here we go. This is a work order. Attached to it is another work order from the studio.
So this just happens to be Minnie Riperton, as I do.
This starts up here. Session would be booked. Dennis would fill in this top corner here. This part here was all to do with special requirements, library. Then it would turn to here when we got in the studio, time we started, time we finished, what we did, all the things that we could possibly do were laid out at the top there. And it was time it started, time it finished. W4s, where the tape was, titles, the tunes. And we had 2 other forms. One was the equivalent of what you would call a track sheet. And the other one was the equivalent of what you would call a legend on a tape. And we had all of that information all coordinated. And everything was done with numbered tapes, so nobody knew what was on the tapes except us. That was our security system. We could have tapes lying around and people would have to play them to find out what they were. And that was a pretty good security system. And you know, we also kept lots of useless tapes around with the good ones. All part of the security system. We were very paranoid in those days. Anyway, when that finished, Dennis would go in and turn it back this way and start putting the prices down. And there were prices for us and also charges for the studio. And any other musicians' costs. We did all the musicians' contracts. We did everything. We did the production, period. We had a whole production company. There were 2 other people involved. One of them was Ulysses Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, the whole number. And no, he wasn't the famous general, but he was very, very important. He was my technician, my wiring technician. I would draw up diagrams and he would build them. And he was a very, very good guy who worked for us for a long time. And the last person, well, actually, there were 2 more. There was Charles, who was a carpenter who did all the woodwork that we needed. That was after the main cases were built. They were built by a guy called Harry Sanger in New York. He built all the cases for IBM prototypes back in the day. And he built the original cases. And then there was Jan. Jan was we were an equal opportunity employer, so she was a lady solderer. She did all the solder work on all those huge cables. Every solder joint in those cables was done by her. And she worked for 3 years on the instrument. And that was all she did, was solder cables from morning till night.
I'm a little bit in between 2 minds here, because just looking at the discography as such, there's people on there like the Isley brothers, Van Dyke Parks, Joan Baez, Minnie Riperton, as we just saw. The T.O.N.T.O albums as such, which are a topic of delight amongst collectors and synthesizers aficionados. And also a lot of the Stevie stuff, obviously, we could talk about for days, and some of that is pretty well documented. What we don't get to hear too much about is your work with another gentleman, and let's play a little bit of music to give you a bit of a breather for a second. And how about this one?
This was a big hit of Gil's. Gil and I met under very interesting circumstances. I had a studio in Santa Monica that I had moved T.O.N.T.O into after the breakup with Bob and Stevie Wonder. I moved out of the studio we had in Point Doom in Malibu, where we recorded with Stevie, Weather Report, Billy Preston, lots of people. And I moved into a shop front in Santa Monica, 1,000 square foot shop front, and turned it into a recording studio. Eventually took the shop next door, and that was 2,000 square feet, which still wasn't really enough, but we managed. And one day I was there, the front door of the shop was open, and it was, we didn't have any air conditioning, so we had the door open. It was a hot day, and this very tall black gentleman put his head into the studio. And, "Oh, it's a recording studio here." I said, "Yes, can I come in and have a look?" So I said, "Yeah, sure." So he says, "I live just around the corner. I didn't know there was a recording studio here, so we just moved here." I said, "Oh, looks great. Oh, you got this big synthesizer." So it turned out the name of the man was Tom Wilson. Not the Tom Wilson from the Beach Boys. The Tom Wilson who was the CBS producer who produced Bob Dylan. He was a very, very interesting, very intellectual guy. And he said, "I have this musical called Gondwana that I need to record. And it's a spec project, but, I can cut you in and da-da-da-da-da." Well, cut a long story short, I went for it, and we started to cut these tunes. And he turned around to me after we'd done 40 songs, and he turned around to me and he said, "You know what?" He said, "I need to bring you some paying work in here." He said, "I've got an album coming up for Arista Records." Clive Davis had just started up Arista. What happened was Clive Davis got caught, or at least the whole company, CBS, got caught. And you heard about the Coca-Cola scam. Do you know about that? The Coca-Cola scandal. What was happening was that the CBS were putting Coke into little packages of Coke into the records they were sending to DJs to get them to play the records. It's true. It all came out, and Clive Davis stepped up to the plate and said, "I'm guilty. It's my fault. I'll take the responsibility. I'll take the blame." And for doing that, he got fired from CBS, but they gave him $20 million to start Arista. So, you know, what can I tell you? Money talks, nobody walks. Anyhow, he decided, he being, of course, Clive Davis, decided that he needed a black act on the label. And so he signed Gil Scott-Heron. And who would he put to produce it but his old producer who had produced Dylan very successfully for CBS for him, but Tom Wilson. So Tom brought Gil in to do the session and came in on the first day and was sitting down there. And Tom had a very interesting style of production, very interesting. He would sit there, put his feet up on the console, open up the Financial Times, and that was it. That's all you'd see. You know, so first day we were recording. We start recording this thing called Hello Sunday, Hello Road. And let's get to about take 5. I think it's a pretty good one. So I turn around to Tom and say, "What do you think, Tom?" He says, "I'll let you know if there's anything wrong." That was his style of production. Let everybody do it. And his idea was that nothing makes the farm grow like the eye of the farmer. You just have to be in the room. You don't have to do anything. If everything is going well, leave it alone. Let it happen. So that was how I met Gil. But the story didn't quite finish there. Halfway through the album, one day, Dion, my assistant, went. Our habit was we would do a song. As soon as we got a take and everything was fine, Tom would leave the studio and say, "Okay, do a mix of it and send it around to me. Do a rough and send it around to me." So Dion would go around with a cassette with the rough mix on it to Tom's house, which was a block and a half away. Well, this particular morning, Tom didn't show. Very unusual. Tom was always there first. So we go through, we get halfway through the session, and there's still no Tom. So both Gil and I are getting a little uneasy. So I say to Dion, run round to Tom's house, make sure everything's all right, make sure he's okay. So Dion goes round. Now, Dion came to me because he walked in when I was building the studio, and I was building the ceiling, which was a gull wing ceiling, and I needed somebody to hold up the thing while I fixed it. And Dion is like 6'4", very long limbs, and he just happened to walk in the door. He was this Dutch guy, and he just, I don't know where he came from. He just walked in the door. And I just turned around and said, excuse me, could you just hold? That's how he started. He never left. He became my assistant. Very, very nice guy. So he went around, and the reason I told you that is because he goes to the room and gets no reply. So being tall, he climbed, Tom's got a apartment, was like there was a basement and then his apartment up a few steps, but he had to be fairly tall to look through the window. So he climbs up onto the railing and looks through the window, sees Tom lying on the floor. So he comes back to the studio, tells us. So Gil and I go round. Well, Gil is about the same size as Dion, 6'10", sort of, that, in that region. Gil's a basketball player. So between the two of them, they managed to get into the window. I think Gil hoisted Dion up and Dion climbed in. Then we got in and we got Tom to the hospital. It turned out that he had had a heart problem. And he had to go in and have an operation. So sort of whole album came to a grinding halt at that point. Tom got out of hospital a couple of months later. We went back to work. 3 weeks later, same thing happens, only this time with not such a good result. This time, unfortunately, Tom was dead. His aorta had burst. And that was it. So here we are with a half-finished album. And Gil turns to me and says, hey, man, will you help me produce and finish this album? So I said, of course. And that's how I came to produce Gil. And we stayed together. We did, I think, 15 albums together. And we were together for about 22 years. And we went through all sorts of changes. We did the Stevie Wonder Hotter Than July tour, 1980, where Gil had the brilliant idea because Gil was booked on that because Bob Marley couldn't make it. Bob Marley was supposed to open for Stevie, and he couldn't make it. So Gil got called to do that at the opening, but it was supposed to be only for the first few shows until Bob Marley was better. He never did get better. But we ended up doing the whole tour. But on the first night, we were in Austin, Texas, and we were up in Stevie's dressing room, and Gil and Stevie and myself and a couple of other the producer of the show and so on, we were talking about how we were going to do the last number, what we were going to do. So we decided that Gil came up with this idea. He said, you know what? It's going to be Martin Luther King's birthday. We should do Happy Birthday to You, because Stevie had already written Happy Birthday to You, Martin Luther King. And he said, you know what? We should exhort everybody to write to their congressman and see if we can't get Martin Luther King Day accepted as a national holiday. That would be something really worthwhile. And Stevie cottoned to this idea right away. Yeah, man, yeah, let's do that. So that became what we were going to do at the end of the show. That was the song that Gil got called back up to work with Stevie at the end of the performance every show. And Gil would get up there and he would exhort everybody to go write their congressman to make Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. And that continued. That we ended up doing the whole 1980 tour, which did take most of 1980. It wasn't continuous, but it was like fits and starts, 6 weeks here, 4 weeks there. Different areas of the country. We would fly there and then go by coach, and then get back on the plane and fly back from whence we came. And it was a very powerful experience for everybody because it went on. Gil then went on to organize with Stevie all of the black artists, musicians, entertainers. Started with the Motown team through Stevie and Gil, and we ended up getting all sorts of people involved. And 4 years later, the law was passed and it became a national holiday, even though 10 years prior to that, 10 years in a row, it had been brought up in Congress and failed 10 years in a row. And this was an amazing accomplishment that was done through music and through the dedication of musicians who thought more about music was more valuable than just love songs. There's so much of music is love songs. So much of music is about interpersonal relationships. But I've always been a proponent of social consciousness. And I believe that social consciousness can be promoted through music. And great achievements can be done. Music isn't all about making $1 million or billions of dollars or selling lots of records or being famous. It's about changing the world. It's about making the world a better place to live in, not just for you and those around you, but for everybody. But everybody who comes within the sound. I've been amazed at the number of people who've come up to me, because you never know your effect upon other people. Very rarely. How often does one get to know one's effect upon other people? My wife Polly had a yoga teacher. She does Iyengar yoga. And she had a yoga teacher who was from France, from a very well-to-do family in France. And Gil had a write-up in a French magazine, very esoteric French magazine. Now, I know schoolboy French. I mean, I have ordinary level French GCE to get my matriculation to get into the Polytechnic. But I couldn't understand 1 in 10 words of this article. I mean, I didn't even start. So I said to Polly, why don't you get Finette to come down to the studio one day after yoga, finagle her to come down and just read the article, translate it on the fly, and I'll set up a mic and a cassette, and then Gil can hear the article. So Polly brings Finette down one day, out of the blue. She just appears at the studio with Finette. So I'm getting ready, I'm getting the mic set up and everything, and Finette's looking at the gold records on the wall. And she gets the talking book, and she goes, oh my God, you did talking book, oh my God, that record changed my life. I go, huh? She then tells me the story. She'd been in the West Indies. She had fallen in love with and had 2 children with a West Indian man that she was deeply in love with. And everything was fine because she was from a well-heeled French family, a French aristocratic family. And so there was no problems until her father found out that the children were not 100% white and cut her off, cut all her payments off, everything. She said, that's it. You're on your own. And the only thing she could do to make money was teach yoga. So she was teaching yoga in the hotels in Jamaica and trying to make ends meet. Well, the husband didn't stay around very long when there was no money around, and so she was left with these 2 children to support. And she said that the only thing that got her up and through the day, every day, was putting on talking book first thing in the morning, every time when she got up. She said, I put that record on, and it got me through the day. So you never know your effect upon other people, and it's very rare to ever find it out. But when you realize things like that are going on, how many other people's lives have been touched by the products that I've been involved with? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But I know that there are people out there who have been touched by it and have been touched by some of the social consciousness things that we did. I mean, Living for the City was no joke. Living for the City was the breakup of Stevie and I, because it was the first time that Stevie really realized he was actually being produced, which is what he hated. That's what he left Motown because of. And as soon as he found out and realized that we'd actually been producing him all this time, I mean, he was under the impression that he was doing it all, which was the whole idea. That's really what you want to do. But it works against you if you use that technique. It's a production technique that I used with Stevie, I've used with a lot of art. It worked with Gil, because Gil understood it, and Gil appreciated it, and Gil listened and did everything I asked him to do. But with Stevie, as soon as he realized that I was actually, quote, producing him, when I started to stop that tape machine, never done it before, but I started actually taking charge in the control room and saying, no, do this, do that, strands of the old Motown came right back into his head, and he's like, no, I'm not having this. And that was the beginning of the end of Stevie and I. That's why, in the end, that's really what broke it up. You can look at money, you can look at business, you can look at all other aspects. That was what it was. He did not want to be produced, even though it made better product. And I only say that not out of ego. I'm saying that because so many people have told me, and I've read in so many different articles, people I don't know, and writers who I've never met, who have no axe to grind with, they've got no reason to support, all seem to concur that the albums that we did together, those Music on My Mind, Talking Book, Innovisions, Fulfillingness First Finale, those are the albums which were the seminal albums that everybody talks about of Stevie's. It also took him 3 years to produce an album after we left. We produced 4 albums in as many years, 2 albums with Sarita, 3 albums with the Isley brothers. It goes on and on and on. The number of albums we produced, the getting it done part of it, the production part, was being done. But when we left, there was nobody to fill in that gap, nobody to book the studio, nobody to ride herd on Stevie and say, hey man, it's going over the top. I like the other take. There was one case in point where we filled up the whole tape with vocal overdubs, and it was time to go back and overdub, because Stevie had done a vocal, and this is probably another important point you should remember. I always do first takes, no matter what. I push the button on first takes, whether they're ready or not, because so many first takes have turned out to be the magical take. You can keep trying, it just gets worse. You go back to first take, there's something magical about it. Okay, there's problems, fix them. Cover them up, do what you've got to do. But if the vibe is there, that's the important thing. You've got to recognize it and say, that's it. So I recognized on the first take of this vocal that we'd done, I forget which song it was now even. As I say, I left Stevie, we put 50 songs out, and I left him with 250 in the can. So 300 songs, you don't remember the stuff. And in fact, I don't remember a fraction of the stuff that I've recorded. So it's just, you can't keep it up there if you're dealing in the now. So I prefer to deal in the now. I'm more interested in what's going on in the project I'm working on right now than anything I did in the past. And I don't listen to the old albums. I'm not familiar with them that much, only when I was in the studio. So with this basic idea that you're trying to produce and get the best possible results out of people at the time, you do these first takes. So I had saved Stevie's first take, and we'd done these 16, 17 more takes on top. Right now out, and basically Stevie had said, no, go over it. But I didn't. I just chose another track and just pulled the fader down. Okay, because my decision was that's too good to go over, and I got spare tracks. So why would I do that? So yes, he thinks we've gone over. The end of the day, okay, I said, well, that's it. That's the last track. We've got to decide which ones whether we're going to go over anything. If you want to do more, yeah, man, we don't got it. Okay, well, come in. I got something I want you to listen to. And I brought him into the control room, and I put the first track up. And he looks around at me and he says, you kept it. He knew what it was right away. Okay, that's the sort of memory he had. He knew what he had done, and he listened to it, and he turns around and he says, hey man, you're right, it's the one. He recognized that he couldn't do it any better than he'd done it there. Now, as a musician, there are many times on Innovisions, on the actual title track here, I'm playing bass. It's the only track on the whole of Stevie's albums, those 4 albums, that I play bass on, upright bass, because it was an acoustic track. And I played this line, boom, boo-doo-doo-doo-dee-da, boom, dee-da, boom, boo-doo-doo-doo-dee-da, boom, dee-da. Okay, and between the first and second verses, there's a little break where it's just the bass doing that line. And so, of course, Mr. Clever has to go, boom, boo-doo-doo-doo-dee-da. I had to put my little twiddly bit in, right? And as soon as I did it, I go, oh, no, why did I do that? Now we're going to have to take it again. But I kept that in a thought. We get to the end of the take, and I turn around to Steve and say, yeah, we've got to do it again. Why, man? Why? That was perfect. I said, well, I screwed up in the bass break. no, man, you played that twiddly thing. I really like that. I go, huh? Well, if you really like it, all right. But I had wanted to do it again because I had this idea that it should be like the way it was written, the way it was, and I had twiddly-deed it up. But it turned out it worked. It was something that actually did work, and it was no reason to take again. So I pass this on to you because and it's the take that's on the record. So, don't try, technical reasons are not good enough reasons to retake a take that's already got feel and vibe to it. It's more important to have the feel and vibe than it is to be technically perfect or to be musically perfect for that matter. You need the overall, how it comes across, what it does, how it makes you feel. That's what's important. Nothing else. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Would there be some questions? There you
go. Thank you for coming.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Okay, all right.
I'm here because of you. If you weren't here, I wouldn't be here.
Tell me about it. So my question, you spoke on vibrations and a little bit on frequency and also on feeling and the emotion of songs and stuff like that. In the past, like maybe 2 months, some of my friends have been getting me into, yoga deals with it, but meditation. I forget what it's called. I can't recall it for the life of me. I was thinking about it this whole time. It's like in the shape of a bowl, and there's a little wooden piece that's similar to this in terms of like shape, and you tap it.
Yeah, it's a singing bowl.
Yeah,
Tibetan.
Tibetan. It emits a vibration and also a frequency that is what like they work intertwined and they affect your emotion and your mood so that you can focus and meditate. My question deals with frequency and how frequency can affect someone's mood in terms of sound or whatever. And if you like study that and incorporate that in any of your songs, like certain frequencies to affect or evoke a certain feeling in someone that was listening to a song.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite as simple as just a frequency because frequency is essentially pitch. There's three things. Sounds are three-dimensional objects in time. Okay? And you can tell this from the language. We talk about three-dimensional objects in space. And a three-dimensional object in space, it has a length, right? It has a height, and it has a thickness. Those are the three dimensions. They're each independent, but for it to be a real object, all three have to be present, at least in some form. Even a monomolecular film of oil on the top of water that makes that rainbowy, that sort of dullish, yellowy, bluey rainbow on the top of, after the rain, you see it on the road. That is a monomolecular film of oil. But it's got it's one molecule thick. It's still got a thickness. If it didn't have a thickness, it wouldn't exist in the real world. If it didn't have a length, it didn't have a width. Now, the same is true of sounds. Sounds are three-dimensional objects in time. They have a length, a duration. They go from that's a duration, a length in time. Okay, we call it length. How long is the note? We use the same term. Then they have height, pitch, low pitch, high pitch, medium pitch. Okay, pitch is the vertical. It's whether you're low, you're medium, or you're high. That's the note. And the third thing they have is thickness. We talk about fat, brassy sounds, thin, reedy sounds. Okay? Fat, thin. It's the tonal quality. So these three things together create just one sound, just one single sound. Now, a sound can have many pitches. For example, you know, we were talking about envelopes before. Maybe we change the voltage, but we don't change the envelope. That sound has like, but it's got numerous pitches, but it's still one envelope. It has a thickness, it has height. So you can look at sounds as being, in a way, you know, music as being like very complex sculptures of individual notes and sounds. And you can play a note in many, many different ways, and you can sing a note in many different ways. You can sing it with different tonal qualities. You can sing it with different intensities. There's many ways that you can vary it, but you're always varying one of the three dimensions. You're either varying the timbral quality, you're varying the pitch, you're varying the duration, or all three in some manner or fashion. And so I don't think it would be true to say that there's a frequency, which is just a pitch, that will do that. But there are things that will evoke certain feelings in certain ways. For example, if you want to create the feeling of tension, one of the ways of doing it is to play notes that don't sit well together. You play notes that are close together. Okay, now, because of the nature of harmonics and the nature of frequencies and the way that they work and the way the harmonics work, as you go higher up the scale, there's a lot more notes that are produced as that will blend with the original. They're all whole multiples of the original frequency. So if you're looking mathematically, let's say 100 cycles, it's a low note, it's a bass note. So you have 100 cycles. 200 cycles is an octave above. 400 cycles is an octave above that, so it doubles. 800 cycles is an octave above that. So every octave, you've got twice as much space. So there's a lot of frequencies in there. But the way we hear them, they divide up proportionally. And the way that we usually hear them is we hear harmonics very easily, although we don't really think about them. They're intrinsic to every note. Everything has harmonic structure to it. And whether or not you have notes that are in that harmonic structure or not is what determines whether or not that note is going to sound, whether those two notes are going to play together. If it's in the harmonic structure, they're going to be what we call consonant, or they're going to sound sweet. Okay? If it's not within the harmonic structure, they're going to sound dissonant, or sound not sweet, like now, there are times when you want it to be, you know, if you're doing a movie score, and you know, the bless you, and the killer's going to come in and he's going to shove this knife through the shower curtain, okay, and kill this lady in the shower, right? As happens in the Bates movie, you know, the Alfred Hitchcock movie. You listen to the soundtrack there. What it is, it's a semitone apart. It's violins going semitone apart, rubbing against each other. Really uncomfortable feeling. So yes, feelings are conveyed not by usually a single frequency, but by the way you combine frequencies. And that's what chords are about. That's what voicings are about. If you take a piano and you look at the harmonic series goes, if you actually take the notes, it's just, you just say 1 times the frequency, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we just looked at the octaves, but in between, okay, from 100 to 200, there's nothing in between, because there's 1 and 2, the two numbers. So 200 is the first, the next harmonic. Next one will be 300. Now 300 is halfway between 2 and 4. It's not quite in the middle, but what is it? It turns out to be the dominant note of, in other words, if your original note is C, the second harmonic will be C, the octave above, and then you'll have G in that octave. And then you'll have C again. The fifth harmonic next, E. Now look at that. C, G, E, but they're in different octaves. Now if you play C, E, G at the bottom of the piano all together, it sounds like mud. But if you play C, skip an octave and a half, play G, skip up over the next C, play E, you're now playing the harmonics of that bottom note. And those harmonics will blend and sound smooth and feel, it will feel very, very consonant. It'll feel sweet. So the strongest voicing of a major chord is C, miss an octave and a half, G, and then E in the next octave. That's the most strong, powerful 3 notes that you can put out to make a major chord, and it sounds great. Much better than C, E, G, anywhere on the piano played close. Okay? And people tend to forget this, but that's the key to understanding the relationship of harmonics and everything else. Harmonics are really important in that they dominate all of music. And if you obey the rules of harmonics and understand the rules of harmonics, you can use them. Doesn't mean everything has to be harmonically perfect, but if everything is in conforming with the harmonic series, it'll sound sweet. And the more you don't conform, the more tensive it's going to sound. And if you're writing film scores, that's very helpful because you now have a tool to be able to tell you, well, how am I going to make this scene more tense? How am I going to come to a point where it gets even more tense than this further on? Well, what am I going to do to make it more? And the harmonic theory will guide you in that. That's an important aspect. And there's, I'm going to be publishing a book on this whole topic, but it's not going to be ready for a little while. But I did a lot of research over my life with this, and it's the one thing, if anything, that I want to leave behind, other than T.O.N.T.O, of course, but it's the one thing that I think will be universally useful that wasn't around when I was born and hopefully will be when I kick up the daisies at the end of my time here. So, you know, which... who knows how long it'll be? I'm 76 now, so it's going to be... I've enjoyed a very good life up to now, and I plan to live to 120. My 3 years stretched, by the way. However, my philosophy didn't change. I still live as if I only have 3 years to live, which may very well be true. You know, you'll find that if you do that, you have a much fuller life. That's probably why I've done all the things I've done. It's because I never set out to do a career path, never had a future in mind. Only the present. To me, the present. And build the present on the past, if it's worth doing. Otherwise, break from it. Make a whole new start. I've done it many times in my life now. And it's never failed me. The only thing I haven't made a new start with is my good lady. We've been together for 55 years. And that's what
Unfortunately, I'm getting a lot of cutthroat signs from in between the curtains.
They've all run out. They've all run out of media. I've run you out of your media.